Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. Lieutenant J. Waller of the 1st Battalion of Royal Marines remembered it vividly. He recalled how his men clambered up the earthen breastworks at Bunker Hill, bayonets fixed, pressing forward against the rebel line. The defenders fired until their powder was gone, and then came the rush. Steel against flesh, muskets clubbed, smoke choking the lungs. Waller admitted that the carnage was beyond description. It was, as he put it, shocking, even for men hardened by war. When the red flag of Britain finally crested the works, victory seemed theirs. But the ground beneath was slick with blood, and nearly half the British attackers had fallen in the charge. This, then, was the paradox of Bunker Hill. A triumph claimed, but at a cost so steep it resembled defeat. British officers congratulated themselves on carrying the position, yet in hushed tones admitted that one or two more victories like it would ruin the army entirely. For the colonists, though they had lost the hill, the battle proved something far more valuable. They had stood toe-to-toe with the most formidable army in the world, and they had not broken easily. To understand the revolution that followed, one must begin here with the smoke curling over Charlestown, the cries of the wounded in the night, and the stunned realization on both sides. This would not be a swift or gentlemanly affair. It would be a brutal, grinding contest of willpower. The American Revolution, we often imagine, was a war of clever ambushes in forests and patriots firing from behind trees. But at Bunker Hill, the truth stood plain. The fight was as much about lines and bayonets as it was about cunning. The rebels fought in formation, resisting until supplies ran out. The British advanced in the manner drilled into them on European fields, yet here in the colonies those tactics led to staggering losses. The war that began with this clash would stretch for 8 relentless years, longer than anyone anticipated. It would drag on nearly as long as the American Civil War, the Mexican-American War, and the Spanish-American War combined. Few in London or Philadelphia could have imagined such a span. But the blood spilled on that hill foreshadowed the attrition to come. For the British, victory meant occupation. For the Americans, defeat still meant hope. And from that moment forward, each side began to reckon with a sobering truth. Neither courage nor discipline alone would decide this struggle. Strategy, supply, foreign intrigue, and above all endurance would shape the destiny of a continent. The revolution had announced itself with fire and fury. Now the question lingered. How could the greatest empire in the world lose to farmers and tradesmen turned soldiers? Or perhaps, was there more to the American cause than we have been taught to believe? When the first volleys cracked across Lexington and Concord in 1775, few on either side imagined the struggle would last nearly a decade. Many in Britain expected a quick police action, a matter of a few regiments sent across the Atlantic to discipline rebellious colonists. In the taverns of New England, patriots boasted that one bold stroke might drive the redcoats back into the sea. Yet, like so many wars in history, the American Revolution stretched far beyond its opening promises, dragging on for 8 long, wearying years. To put this into perspective, 8 years was nearly the same length as 3 major conflicts combined: the American Civil War, the Mexican-American War, and the Spanish-American War. Those later wars burned hot and fierce, but they were brief by comparison. The Revolution, by contrast, was a war of slow attrition, a contest not only of muskets, but of endurance, of which side could outlast the other. There is a temptation to imagine the war as a grand duel of styles, British soldiers standing stiff in bright red lines, while Americans melted into the trees, sniping from cover like ghosts. The reality was far more complicated. Skirmishes and ambushes certainly occurred, but they were not what won the war. The decisive battles, the ones that shifted momentum, were fought in conventional formations, in open fields, with bayonets and cannons roaring. At Trenton, Princeton, and Yorktown, the Americans triumphed not through guerrilla tricks, but by adapting European-style tactics to American conditions. Washington's army marched, drilled, and bled in the same fashion as the armies of Europe. Only they did so with fewer supplies, less training, and far greater risks of collapse. Guerrilla fighters, local militias, and sharpshooters did their part, harassing supply lines and keeping British forces uneasy. But the heavy lifting of independence rested on the Continental Army, a force that had to learn, painfully and slowly, how to stand toe-to-toe with the most professional army on Earth. And so the revolution must be understood for what it was. Not a quick uprising, not a one-sided tale of scrappy underdogs, but a protracted war of exhaustion. The British bled resources across an ocean, while the Americans bled men and morale at home. What unfolded was a contest shaped as much by distance, politics, and logistics as by musket fire. Already by 1776, this truth was sinking in. For every British victory that painted the map red, there came the sobering realization that conquest did not equal control. For every American defeat, there lingered the whisper that they had endured one more day, and one more day meant hope. The revolution was becoming something larger than anyone had imagined. Not just a colonial revolt, but a test of endurance between empire and insurgency. The coming years would pit personalities, strategies, and entire societies against each other, forcing both Britain and America to learn that wars are not always won by those who appear stronger at the outset. The revolution was not only a clash of armies, it was a contest of leadership. At the heart of the patriot cause stood men whose names would be remembered, though not always in glory. Foremost was George Washington, appointed commander of the Continental Army in 1775. Tall, imposing, and reserved, Washington's very presence inspired a sense of steadiness among troops who often had little else to cling to. He was no flawless general. His defeat in New York was nearly catastrophic, almost costing the cause in its first year. But his strength lay less in tactical genius than in resilience. He understood that survival was victory. At Boston, he forced the British to abandon the city. At Trenton and Princeton, he seized fleeting chances, striking with daring and precision in the dead of winter. In these moments, Washington revealed himself not as a Napoleon before his time, but as something perhaps rarer, a commander who knew when not to fight and when to risk everything. Then there was Horatio Gates, hailed as the hero of Saratoga. It was under his nominal command that the British surrendered one of their largest armies, a triumph that electrified Europe and convinced France to openly join the war. Yet Gates's star rose too fast. Drunk on his fame, he overestimated his own abilities, leading to the disaster at Camden, where his army collapsed against Cornwallis's bayonet charges. His fall was swift and humiliating, a reminder that glory in war is fragile and reputations can turn to dust in a single afternoon. Standing in Gates's shadow was a man whose name has become synonymous with treachery, Benedict Arnold. Before his betrayal, however, Arnold was among the Revolution's most daring and effective commanders. He seized Fort Ticonderoga, giving the Americans vital artillery. At Saratoga, though Gates claimed the laurels, it was Arnold who led the furious assaults that broke the British line. Fierce, impetuous, and endlessly ambitious, Arnold seemed destined for greatness. But grievances, some real, some imagined, festered. Passed over for promotion, accused of corruption, and alienated from fellow officers, Arnold chose infamy over loyalty. His defection to the British shocked the nation, a wound deeper than any battlefield loss. In Arnold's story, we glimpse the Revolution's darker truth. Not every patriot remained steadfast, and the line between honor and ambition could be perilously thin. Finally, there was Nathanael Greene, Washington's most trusted lieutenant. Calm where others were rash, thoughtful where others were impulsive, Greene transformed the war in the South. After Gates's failure, Greene took command and employed a strategy of endurance, skirmishing, retreating, stretching British supply lines to breaking. He rarely won battles outright, but he won the campaign, bleeding Cornwallis's army until it was forced into retreat. Washington once remarked that Greene was second only to him in importance to the American cause. If Washington was the Revolution's steadfast heart, Greene was its calculating mind. These men, Washington the unbreakable, Gates the flawed, Arnold the traitor, Greene the strategist, embodied the contradictions of the Revolution. They were not mythic heroes, but human beings, ambitious, uncertain, sometimes brilliant, sometimes deeply fallible. Yet it was through their choices and their failures that the Revolution stumbled forward toward survival. The American command was a patchwork, often undermined by politics, personal rivalries, and inexperience. But within that fragile structure lay the spark of something enduring. Leaders who, despite their flaws, adapted to a war unlike any they had fought before. If the American generals were forged by necessity, the British commanders arrived polished by years of formal service. They carried with them the weight of empire, the traditions of a professional officer corps, and the expectation that this colonial revolt would be snuffed out with little difficulty. Yet, for all their experience, they found themselves entangled in a war that consumed reputations and revealed the limits of imperial might. The first of these was General William Howe, who inherited overall command after the bloody spectacle of Bunker Hill. Howe was no incompetent. He had served with distinction in earlier wars and knew the craft of siege and maneuver. His capture of New York in 1776 nearly crushed the rebellion, forcing Washington's battered army to retreat across New Jersey. Later, he occupied Philadelphia, the heart of the colonies. But Howe's caution, his preference for comfortable quarters and winter balls over relentless pursuit, proved costly. His decision to focus on Philadelphia left his colleague, General John Burgoyne, stranded in upstate New York. The result was catastrophe. Burgoyne's entire army surrounded and forced to surrender at Saratoga. Howe's victories glittered on the map, but strategically they rang hollow. Burgoyne himself was the embodiment of British overconfidence. Nicknamed Gentleman Johnny, he was charismatic and ambitious, yet woefully ill-prepared for the logistical nightmare of campaigning through the dense forests of northern New York. His plan to cut off New England by marching down from Canada looked elegant on paper but collapsed under the reality of wilderness roads, stretched supply lines, and an enemy that harried him at every turn. His surrender in 1777 was not merely a military defeat. It was a turning point in world opinion, convincing France that the American cause was viable. In the wake of these blunders, Sir Henry Clinton assumed command. Clinton was intelligent and aware of the challenges Britain faced, but he was also cautious to a fault. Operating across an ocean, dependent on erratic instructions from London, Clinton rarely risked decisive action. He consolidated British positions, but his inability or unwillingness to deliver a killing blow allowed the revolution to drag on. The most aggressive of Britain's generals was Charles Cornwallis. Ruthless and energetic, he carved his way through the South, winning battles in Georgia and the Carolinas. His victories spread alarm among patriots and seemed to restore British momentum. Yet Cornwallis's boldness became his undoing. Pursued and harassed by Nathaniel Greene, he pushed too far, stretching his forces thin until he was driven into retreat. His final stand at Yorktown would end in humiliation, surrendering not just his army, but Britain's hopes of crushing the rebellion. Taken together, the British High Command reveals a troubling picture. Officers of great skill and pedigree, but hobbled by poor coordination, fractured strategy, and the immense burden of distance. Orders from London could take months to arrive, by which time the realities on the ground had shifted entirely. What might have succeeded in the open fields of Europe faltered in the vast, untamed landscapes of North America. More than once, British generals underestimated the Americans. Not their courage, perhaps, but their endurance. Howe, Burgoyne, Clinton, Cornwallis. Each in his way contributed to Britain's misfortune. It was not incompetence alone that doomed them, but the slow, grinding realization that even the finest generals cannot overcome every obstacle when fighting 3,000 miles from home. On paper, the balance of experience tilted heavily toward Britain. Many of its generals had studied at military academies, steeped in the doctrines of European warfare, how to maneuver lines of infantry, employ artillery, and conduct sieges against fortified towns. They had fought in the great conflicts of the 18th century, from the 7 Years' War to campaigns across Europe and India. By contrast, most American officers had little more than militia service to their names. Their understanding of warfare pieced together from scattered engagements along colonial frontiers. Yet the revolution did not unfold on the plains of Flanders or the fields of Saxony. It raged across dense forests, rocky hills, winding rivers, and vast stretches of untamed countryside. The very land conspired to blunt Britain's advantage. Roads were poor, bridges fragile, and maps unreliable. Where British officers tried to apply textbook maneuvers, American commanders exploited their intimate knowledge of the terrain. They understood the rhythms of rivers, the cover of wooded ridges, the the choke points where a few men could delay an entire column. The 7 Years' War had been a harsh tutor for many Americans, Washington among them. Though his early service ended in blunders, it taught him the unforgiving lessons of frontier warfare: supply lines that vanished in the wilderness, sudden ambushes from unseen enemies, the impossibility of relying on European drill alone. Men like Washington and Greene carried these memories into the Revolution, shaping their understanding that survival mattered more than grand displays of battlefield brilliance. For the British, terrain was more than an inconvenience. It was an enemy in its own right. Every mile marched inland pulled their troops farther from naval resupply. Wagons bogged down in muddy tracks, horses died from exhaustion, and supply trains stretched thin across hostile countryside. Local guides could mislead or abandon them. Scouts struggled to penetrate thickets where riflemen lurked. The vastness of America devoured Britain's strength one step at a time. Even in moments of triumph, the terrain mocked their efforts. After seizing cities like New York or Philadelphia, the British found that control of urban centers did not translate into control of the surrounding countryside. The rebels melted into forests, striking supply convoys, harassing stragglers, forcing the redcoats to march and countermarch with no end in sight. This contrast, formal experience versus lived familiarity, did not guarantee American victories, but it eroded Britain's ability to press its advantages. A European-trained officer could orchestrate a flawless maneuver on the parade ground, yet in the thickets of New Jersey or the swamps of the Carolinas, his soldiers found themselves bewildered, ambushed, and exhausted. Meanwhile, American commanders, though less polished, gradually transformed adversity into opportunity. They learned to fight not just the enemy, but the land itself, turning hills, rivers, and woods into silent allies. In this way, geography became one of the Revolution's most decisive weapons. Britain's experience was undeniable, but America's terrain, and the men who understood it, would prove just as formidable as any general on the field. If one watches popular documentaries or even listens to schoolhouse tales, the American Revolution is often painted as a struggle between two utterly different ways of war. On one side, the British marching stiffly in bright red ranks. On the other, clever Americans sniping from behind rocks and trees. It is a compelling story, but like many myths, it obscures more than it reveals. The truth is that America did not win independence with militias lurking in the underbrush. Guerrilla tactics played a role, yes, harassing convoys, disrupting messengers, sowing unease. But decisive battles, the ones that broke armies and shifted momentum, were fought with drilled regiments standing in ordered lines. The Continental Army, not the part-time militia, bore the true weight of the Revolution. The militia were fickle allies at best. They were often untrained, under-equipped, and most importantly, not bound to fight. A farmer might march to a battlefield in one campaign, then simply vanish the next week to tend his crops. Some refused to serve far from home. At moments of crisis, whole companies melted away overnight, leaving commanders scrambling to fill the gaps. Their muskets varied in quality, their powder was scarce, and their discipline frequently failed under the pressure of bayonet charges. Contrast this with the British redcoat. He was drilled to fire 3 volleys a minute, his movements precise, his endurance hammered into him through relentless training. Most carried the bayonet, a weapon as much psychological as practical. When the order came to charge, glittering steel thrust forward in a solid wall, militia often broke and ran before contact was even made. To face such a charge required not just courage, but the kind of hardened discipline that only a standing army could maintain. American riflemen added some color to the battlefield, the famed sharpshooters wielding Kentucky long rifles, deadly accurate at greater range than the standard musket. They picked off officers and sowed panic in enemy ranks. Yet their numbers were tiny, perhaps 3% of the Continental Army at best. Useful, yes. Decisive, no. The Revolution could not rest on their shoulders. The Continental Army, ragged and underfed as it was, learned to fight in lines. Washington insisted on discipline even when his men lacked shoes. Baron von Steuben, a Prussian veteran, transformed raw recruits into soldiers capable of maneuvering with precision, drilling them endlessly at Valley Forge. It was this transformation, the evolution from a collection of militias into a true army, that gave the revolution its backbone. Thus, the popular image of rebels in buckskins forever ambushing from the woods misses the essence of the struggle. America did not defeat Britain by rejecting European warfare, but by mastering enough of it to survive. The militia harassed, the riflemen harried. But the Continental Army, battered and stubborn, stood in the line of battle and proved that independence would not be won in skirmishes alone. To understand why the revolution lasted so long, one must first grasp what it meant to face a British redcoat. These were not raw recruits, but professional soldiers, drilled in the art of war from dawn to dusk. Their uniforms of scarlet wool may seem flamboyant to modern eyes, but to contemporaries, the redcoat was a symbol of authority, discipline, and fear. The British Army of the 18th century was among the most disciplined in the world. A redcoat could fire and reload his musket in 15 to 20 seconds, faster than most Continental soldiers could hope to manage. Hours of drill turned firing lines into machines of destruction, each volley slamming out like clockwork. Officers demanded precision, muskets raised as one, fire rippling down the line, bayonets leveled in perfect unison. And then there was the charge. If volleys failed to break an enemy, the order came, "Fix bayonets." To militia or half-trained recruits, the sight of hundreds of gleaming blades advancing in silence was often too much to bear. Entire companies dissolved before the redcoats even reached them. At Camden, when British grenadiers advanced with bayonets drawn, the American line broke and fled in minutes. It was not courage alone that held an army together under such pressure. It was discipline, and that was Britain's greatest weapon. Elite units amplified this power. Grenadiers, tall and imposing, were often positioned on the right flank, where their sheer presence could shatter morale. Light infantry companies, trained to move quickly and adapt to irregular terrain, gave the British flexibility in pursuit and skirmish. These formations represented the cutting edge of European warfare, and they were honed through decades of campaigning across the globe. To colonial farmers, hastily turned soldiers, such opponents seemed unstoppable. Many wrote in their diaries of the awe and dread they felt when facing the steady ranks of British regulars. Even experienced Continental officers admitted that to stand against a bayonet charge required nerves of iron. And yet, the very professionalism of the redcoat could be a double-edged sword. The rigidness of their drill, designed for European battlefields, sometimes struggled in America's wilderness. Volley fire that worked perfectly on flat fields became less effective when trees and hills broke the lines. Bayonet charges could terrify militia, but were less decisive against seasoned Continentals who learned to hold firm. Still, the reputation of the redcoat endured. He was not invincible, but he was formidable. For much of the war, the British soldier remained the most feared element on the battlefield. If the Americans were to triumph, they would have to prove that courage, adaptation, and resilience could withstand the might of one of history's most professional armies. No army can march without weapons, and in the American Revolution, what soldiers carried in their hands often shaped the course of the fighting. Both the British and the Americans wielded muskets as their primary tool of war, but behind those weapons lay very different systems of supply and very different struggles to keep men armed. The British carried the Brown Bess, a 75 caliber flintlock musket that had been the backbone of the Empire's armies for nearly a century. It was sturdy, reliable, and designed for the rhythm of volley fire, line upon line of soldiers unleashing smoke and shot in unison. Each musket was fitted for a bayonet, making it as much a thrusting weapon as a firearm. The Brown Bess was more than a gun. It was a symbol of imperial power, standardized and mass-produced, the mark of a professional army. Across the lines, the Americans carried a patchwork of arms at first. Some had their own hunting pieces, others seized captured Brown Besses. But gradually, thanks to French support, the Charleville musket became their standard. Slightly smaller in caliber at 69, it was lighter, easier to handle, and well suited for the kind of quick volleys and bayonet charges that Washington's men were learning to execute. French shipments of these muskets, and the powder to fire them, were lifelines without which the Continental Army could scarcely have continued. Then there were the rifles, romanticized in legend but often misunderstood. The Kentucky long rifle, with its grooved barrel, could hit a target at distances a musket could not dream of. American riflemen gained fame for picking off officers from afar, striking terror into British ranks unused to such marksmanship. Yet rifles were slow to load, lacked bayonets, and were far too few to alter the outcome of great battles. They were a scalpel where the war required hammers. Beyond the weapons themselves lay the grimmer story of logistics. For the British, muskets and powder were plentiful, but every round, every cartridge had to be shipped across an ocean. A single storm could delay supplies for weeks, even months. Reinforcements often arrived too late, their effectiveness swallowed by the sheer distances involved. The Redcoats, for all their power, were chained to the ports, unable to march too far inland without risking starvation or mutiny. For the Americans, the challenge was even starker. Early in the war, powder was so scarce that soldiers sometimes went into battle with only a few rounds apiece. Muskets broke, bayonets were in short supply, uniforms and shoes wore out with no replacements in sight. Washington pleaded constantly with Congress for supplies, but the fledgling government lacked both funds and infrastructure. At Valley Forge, soldiers trained barefoot in the snow, muskets held together with twine, their spirits sustained less by equipment than by sheer determination. It was foreign aid that tipped the scales. French muskets, Spanish silver, Dutch loans, all flowed into the rebellion, slowly transforming ragged volunteers into a true army. Every Charleville musket delivered was a step toward survival. Every crate of powder smuggled past British blockades was a spark of hope. Thus, the arming of the armies was more than a matter of steel and wood. It was a mirror of the war itself. Britain's power was vast but stretched thin. America's weakness was crippling, yet slowly compensated by allies abroad. In every musket fired, in every bayonet charge, one can hear not only the clash of armies, but the echo of supply ships creaking across the Atlantic, carrying the tools of both conquest and independence. If muskets and powder told one side of the revolution, hunger and frost told the other. Nowhere is this truth more stark than at Valley Forge, the winter encampment of 1777-1778. Here, in the frozen hills of Pennsylvania, the revolution nearly withered before it had the chance to bloom. The numbers are haunting. Of the 12,000 men who marched into the encampment, nearly 2,000 would not march out. They perished not by British bullets, but by starvation, disease, and exposure. Frostbitten feet blackened and rotted. Soldiers huddled in crude huts that barely kept out the wind. Many lacked coats, blankets, even shoes. Washington's men left bloody footprints in the snow as they drilled, their souls worn away to nothing. Diaries and letters speak with a quiet despair. One soldier described gnawing on boiled leather for lack of food. Another wrote that he had not seen bread for weeks. The specter of desertion loomed large. Many wondered if the cause was doomed, if it was worth dying by inches in the bitter cold. Washington himself, pacing among his men, confessed in private letters that the army teetered on the edge of dissolution. And yet, Valley Forge was not merely a scene of suffering, it was a crucible. Amid the smoke of meager fires came the arrival of Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, a Prussian officer who spoke little English but carried with him the art of professional drill. Day after day, he trained ragged soldiers into disciplined ranks. He taught them to reload faster, to maneuver with precision, to hold firm against the dreaded bayonet charges. His methods were harsh, but his humor and dedication endeared him to the men. By spring, the army that staggered out of Valley Forge was not the same as the one that had entered. This transformation was as critical as any battlefield victory. Valley Forge became the symbol of the revolution's endurance, the idea that survival itself was triumph. The men had faced not just the enemy, but hunger, frost, and despair, and they had endured. Out of the misery of winter emerged an army forged in hardship, no longer a collection of militias, but a true continental force. The memory of Valley Forge lingered long after the war. To patriots, it was proof that independence had been earned in blood and sacrifice, not only on the battlefield, but in the long months of waiting, suffering, and refusing to break. To the soldiers who survived, it was a scar they carried for life, a reminder that liberty was not born in glory, but in endurance. Thus, when we speak of the revolution, we must remember Valley Forge, not as a battle, but as a test of will. It was here, in hunger and death, that America's army learned the strength to fight on. The Revolution is often remembered as a united struggle of colonists against the British Crown, but the truth was far more complicated. The war did not merely pit Americans against redcoats. It set neighbor against neighbor, father against son, community against community. It was as much a civil war as it was a war for independence. Support for the Patriot cause varied dramatically by region. In New England and much of the North, resentment against British trade restrictions and taxes ran deep. Merchants chafed under London's regulations. Farmers bristled at troops quartered in their towns. Here, independence carried an undeniable appeal. Yet in other places, particularly in the South, loyalty to Britain remained strong. Wealthy planters often feared that a revolution could unravel the social order, ignite slave uprisings, or undermine their economic ties to Britain. The Loyalists, Americans who sided with the Crown, were not a fringe minority. By some estimates, they made up a fifth of the colonial population, perhaps more. They included royal officials, Anglican clergy, merchants tied to British trade, and even ordinary farmers who simply feared the chaos of rebellion. For them, the Crown represented stability, while the Patriot cause seemed reckless and dangerous. The division could turn violent. Families split apart when sons chose different sides. Entire towns were torn by reprisals. Loyalist homes were burned, their property seized, their families driven into exile. Patriots, in turn, endured raids and massacres carried out by Loyalist militias and their native allies. In the Carolinas, the fighting often devolved into brutal local feuds, with neighbors settling old grudges under the banner of politics. Religion, too, played a role. Congregationalists and Presbyterians leaned heavily toward independence, while many Anglicans held to loyalty. Sermons thundered from pulpits, some proclaiming the rebellion as a sacred struggle for liberty, others denouncing it as sinful rebellion against God's ordained authority. The revolution seeped into every facet of life, shaping not just politics but the deepest moral and spiritual convictions of the people. Even within the Patriot movement, unity was elusive. Congress quarreled endlessly, state governments resisted central authority, and commanders in the field sometimes pursued personal glory at the expense of cooperation. Yet despite these divisions, the idea of independence spread, binding enough people together to sustain the cause. This fractured support is vital to understanding the revolution. It was not a unanimous uprising of 13 colonies, but a messy, contested, often violent struggle that turned communities into battlegrounds. The revolution was both a war of liberation and a war of identity, forcing Americans to decide not just whether to break from Britain, but who they truly were. In the end, the Patriots prevailed not because they commanded unanimous loyalty, but because they built a cause compelling enough to hold together long enough. Their opponents were never few, but they were scattered, disorganized, and reliant on British strength that stretched thin across the ocean. The revolution's greatest danger was always internal, and yet, despite the fractures, the vision of independence endured. For the first 2 years of the revolution, America stood largely alone. Ragged militias and the fledgling Continental Army faced the greatest empire in the world with little more than borrowed powder and desperate resolve. But the war's fate would not be decided solely in Boston or Philadelphia. It would be shaped in Paris, Madrid, and Amsterdam, in the palaces of kings and the halls of finance. The revolution became a global struggle not because America was strong, but because Britain had enemies everywhere. France was the first and most crucial ally. Still smarting from its defeat in the 7 Years' War, humiliated by the loss of Canada and India, France saw in the American Rebellion a chance for revenge. At first, French support came quietly, shipments of muskets, powder, and uniforms smuggled through the Caribbean. French officers volunteered their swords, among them a young, idealistic aristocrat, the Marquis de Lafayette. Barely 19, Lafayette crossed the ocean to fight for liberty in a land he had never seen, binding his destiny to Washington's army. His zeal inspired the Americans and lent their cause legitimacy abroad. After Saratoga, France made its move openly. In 1778, it signed a treaty of alliance, recognizing American independence and committing ships, soldiers, and treasure to the fight. The balance of power shifted overnight. No longer was Britain battling rebellious colonies. It was facing a coalition war. Spain soon followed, though more cautious. Its interest was less in liberty than in reclaiming lost territories and weakening Britain's hold over the seas. Spanish forces attacked British positions along the Gulf Coast and the Mississippi, while fleets joined the French in challenging British dominance in the Atlantic. Meanwhile, the Dutch provided vital loans, funneling money that kept the struggling Continental Congress afloat. Britain suddenly found itself encircled. What began as a colonial rebellion now threatened to become a global conflict stretching from the Caribbean to Gibraltar, from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. The Royal Navy, once supreme, strained to protect trade routes and distant possessions. The Siege of Gibraltar in 1779, the largest battle of the entire Revolution in terms of manpower, drew tens of thousands of troops into a contest far from American shores. Though Britain held Gibraltar, the cost in resources was immense. International aid did more than supply muskets and ships. It gave the American cause legitimacy. Patriots who once feared they might be crushed now saw European powers aligning with them. The war for independence became a war of empires, and America, fragile though it was, stood at the center of it. Yet this aid came with irony. France and Spain did not support Republican ideals. They supported their own dynastic ambitions. America's liberty was, to them, a weapon to weaken Britain. Still, whatever the motives, the effect was undeniable. Without French ships, Yorktown would never have been possible. Without Spanish pressure, Britain might have redeployed more forces to the colonies. Without Dutch money, the Continental Army might have simply dissolved. The Revolution was no longer an isolated struggle. It had become a world war, and Britain's might, spread thin across oceans and continents, was beginning to fray. From the beginning, Britain's commanders believed the key to victory lay in cities. They were the nodes of commerce, government, and communication. Capture Boston, capture New York, capture Philadelphia. Surely the rebellion would collapse once its centers of resistance were cut away. It was a strategy that reflected European thinking. Wars were won by holding capitals and fortresses, by seizing the arteries of trade and authority. And at first, the logic seemed sound. In 1776, General William Howe captured New York, forcing Washington's battered army into retreat. The city, the largest in the colonies, became the crown jewel of British occupation. A year later, Philadelphia, the heart of colonial politics, fell into British hands. Redcoats paraded through its streets while Congress fled into the countryside. London rejoiced, imagining the rebellion on the brink of collapse. But in America, cities were not the war. They were trophies, yes, but they were islands in a vast sea of resistance. Occupying New York or Philadelphia did not mean controlling the farms, the villages, or the countryside where the Revolution drew its strength. As soon as British troops moved outward, supply lines stretched thin, vulnerable to ambushes and raids. They could win a city, but holding the land beyond it proved maddeningly elusive. The flaw in the strategy became clear at Saratoga. General John Burgoyne marched down from Canada in 1777, intending to slice New England off from the other colonies. His army was meant to meet Howe's in a great convergence, but Howe had chosen to seize Philadelphia instead, leaving Burgoyne isolated in the forests of upstate New York. Starved of supplies, harassed on every side, his army collapsed into surrender. What was meant to be a masterstroke became a disaster of historic proportions. Britain's fixation on cities created further problems. Garrisons consumed manpower that could not be spared elsewhere. Communication across the Atlantic added another layer of confusion. Orders from London arrived months late, often contradicting the realities on the ground. Generals argued, plans faltered, and coordination broke down. By clinging to the old European model of conquest, Britain found itself bleeding resources without ever delivering a decisive blow. The American countryside remained stubbornly defiant. Farmers supplied rebel forces, militias gathered and scattered at will, and Washington's army, though beaten repeatedly, never vanished. The fall of a city might have crippled a European kingdom. In America, it was a wound, but not a fatal one. This was the great miscalculation of British strategy. They fought to seize points on a map, while the Revolution fought for time and survival. And as the years wore on, the weight of distance, miscommunication, and the sheer size of the continent turned those captured cities into gilded cages, symbols of power that masked the reality of Britain's failing grip. In the earliest days of the Revolution, the Americans often tried to fight as Europeans did, pitched battles, grand assaults, bold gambles, and almost without fail, those gambles ended in disaster. The invasion of Canada in 1775 meant to rally French Canadians to the cause, collapsed in hunger and frost. Washington's defense of New York turned into a rout, his army nearly encircled and destroyed. Even when the rebels fought bravely, as at Bunker Hill, they paid dearly in casualties and gained little. These failures forced a hard lesson upon the Continental Army. Glory was not the path to victory. Survival was. Washington, unlike Horatio Gates or Benedict Arnold, grasped this truth with grim clarity. He did not need to win great battles. He needed only to keep his army alive. So long as the Continental Army existed, the Revolution lived. That meant retreating when necessary, refusing battle on unfavorable terms, and striking only when the odds tipped sharply in his favor. At Trenton, in the dead of winter, Washington gambled just enough, crossing the icy Delaware to surprise a Hessian garrison. It was a small victory, but it electrified a nation weary of defeat. At Princeton, he struck again, slipping away from superior forces to pounce on an isolated British detachment. These triumphs were not decisive in military terms, but in psychological ones. They reminded Americans that their cause was not hopeless. This philosophy of war matured over time. By the later years, American commanders like Nathaniel Greene perfected the art of attrition. Greene rarely sought direct confrontation. Instead, he stretched Cornwallis thin across the Carolinas, fighting skirmishes, harassing supply lines, retreating before overwhelming strength. Every engagement weakened the British, not by breaking them in a single clash, but by bleeding them slowly, relentlessly. It was a strategy born not of theory, but of necessity. The Americans could not afford to lose men recklessly, nor could they replace losses as Britain could. Their army was fragile, always on the brink of collapse, plagued by desertion and supply shortages. Yet by fighting selectively, by forcing the British to chase shadows, the Americans turned weakness into strength. In many ways, this adaptation echoed the landscape itself. America was vast, untamed, and resistant to domination. Just as the forests and rivers consumed British campaigns, so too did the Americans adopt a strategy of endurance, absorbing blows and retreating, only to re-emerge when least expected. Failure, then, was not the end. It was the teacher. The Americans learned through bitter defeats what kind of war they could and could not fight. They could not match Britain musket for musket in open fields, but they could refuse annihilation, deny Britain easy victories, and wait for the Empire's will to break. By the time the French fleet entered the war, the Americans had already reshaped their approach into something uniquely suited to their struggle. Washington's refusal to gamble the Revolution on one desperate showdown ensured that when the decisive moment did arrive, at Saratoga, at Yorktown, the American army was still there to seize it. The Revolution was, in the end, a study in adaptation. From the ashes of failure, the Americans learned the discipline of patience. From defeat, they forged the wisdom to endure. In the summer of 1777, Britain gambled on a bold plan. General John Burgoyne, Gentleman Johnny, would march south from Canada with a large army, cutting through the wilderness of upstate New York. His objective was to seize control of the Hudson River, splitting rebellious New England off from the rest of the colonies. In theory, another British force under General Howe would march north from New York City to meet him, tightening a vice around the heart of the rebellion. On paper, it was elegant. In reality, it was a disaster waiting to unfold. The American wilderness devoured Burgoyne's progress. Dense forests, muddy roads, and long supply lines slowed his army to a crawl. Every wagon, every cannon had to be dragged through terrain that swallowed horses and exhausted men. Local militias harassed his columns, felling trees across roads, picking off stragglers, and denying him food. Meanwhile, Howe had chosen to march on Philadelphia instead, leaving Burgoyne to his fate. By September, Burgoyne's army, tired and undersupplied, faced a growing American force near Saratoga. Under General Horatio Gates, though much of the real credit belonged to Benedict Arnold, the Americans stood their ground. At Freeman's Farm and Bemis Heights, Arnold led furious counterattacks, rallying his men and hurling them against British lines until Burgoyne's troops broke. Surrounded, starved, and with no hope of relief, Burgoyne surrendered his entire army of nearly 6,000 men. The surrender at Saratoga was more than a military victory. It was a political earthquake. For the first time, a major British force had been decisively defeated and captured. The myth of British invincibility cracked. In Europe, diplomats took note. France, long watching from the sidelines, now saw proof that the American cause was not a doomed rebellion, but a viable war for independence. In 1778, France entered the conflict openly, bringing with it fleets, money, and soldiers. Spain and the Netherlands would soon follow, drawn less by love of liberty than by the chance to weaken Britain. For the Americans, Saratoga was a surge of hope. Soldiers and civilians alike celebrated, believing the tide had finally turned. But the victory also revealed the fragile nature of American command. Gates basked in the glory, claiming the laurels, while Arnold, whose leadership had been decisive, fumed at the slight. Wounded in battle, embittered, and feeling unrecognized, Arnold's resentment would fester, eventually pushing him down the path of betrayal. Thus, Saratoga, the Revolution's greatest triumph, also planted the seeds of its most infamous treachery. Still, in the broader arc of the war, Saratoga was the hinge upon which everything turned. Without it, France might never have risked open war with Britain. Without French ships, Yorktown would have been impossible. Without European support, the revolution might have withered in exhaustion. Saratoga proved that the Americans could not only survive, but win, and that revelation changed the world. After Saratoga and France's entry into the war, Britain found itself on the defensive in the north. New England was too fiercely rebellious, and the middle colonies too unstable to secure. So London shifted its gaze to the south. The strategy was simple: exploit loyalist sentiment in the Carolinas and Georgia, rally those loyal to the crown, and roll northward, strangling the rebellion from its softer underbelly. At first, the plan seemed to work. British forces swept into Georgia in 1778, capturing Savannah. The following year, Charleston, one of the South's most important ports, fell after a brutal siege. Thousands of American soldiers were taken prisoner, the largest surrender of Patriot forces in the entire war. The British command, emboldened, believed the South could be pacified with a mixture of military might and loyalist support. Into this theater stepped Charles Cornwallis. Bold, aggressive, and convinced of his mission, Cornwallis carved a path of victories through the Carolinas. At Camden in 1780, Horatio Gates, who had been lionized as the hero of Saratoga, led a poorly prepared American army into battle. When British regulars advanced with bayonets, the militia on Gates's flanks broke and fled almost instantly. The rout was total, and Gates himself fled nearly 200 miles in retreat. It was one of the darkest moments of the Revolution, and morale in the South plummeted. But where Gates failed, Nathanael Greene emerged. Washington entrusted him with the shattered remnants of the Southern Army, and Greene adopted a strategy of patience. He knew he could not match Cornwallis man for man. Instead, he embraced a war of endurance. Greene wrote, "We fight, get beat, rise, and fight again." His goal was not to win set-piece battles, but to bleed Cornwallis, to stretch his supply lines, to wear down his strength by degrees. Greene divided his forces, forcing Cornwallis to chase him across vast swaths of the Carolinas. At Cowpens, Daniel Morgan, serving under Greene, executed a brilliant double envelopment, luring the British into a trap and crushing one of their best units. At Guilford Courthouse, Greene's men fought hard before retreating, leaving Cornwallis technically victorious, but at a cost so severe it hollowed out his army. Meanwhile, the countryside burned with irregular warfare. Patriot partisans like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, harassed British detachments, ambushed convoys, and melted into the wilderness. Loyalist and Patriot militias clashed in brutal civil war, neighbors turning on one another with ferocity that shocked even seasoned officers. The South became not just a battlefield, but a patchwork of vengeance and reprisal. By the summer of 1781, Cornwallis had chased Greene deep into North Carolina, but found himself dangerously overextended. His supply lines stretched thin, his men exhausted, his victories increasingly hollow. Greene, though often retreating, had achieved his aim. Cornwallis's advance had cost him more than it had gained. The British general, seeking refuge and reinforcements, turned northward, toward Virginia, and ultimately toward Yorktown. The Southern gamble had begun with confidence, but it ended by luring Britain into a trap of its own making. Cornwallis's victories filled dispatches with glory, yet each step forward only carried him closer to disaster. By 1781, Cornwallis's march through the South had drained his strength. He had won battles but lost the war of attrition, bleeding men and supplies he could not replace. Now, seeking a secure base with access to the Royal Navy, Cornwallis moved his army north into Virginia and fortified a small coastal town, Yorktown. It seemed a safe position, hemmed in by rivers and with the sea at his back. In reality, it was a cage waiting to be shut. For George Washington, the opportunity was irresistible. Long frustrated by years of stalemate around New York, he seized upon intelligence that the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse would sail north from the Caribbean. If Washington could coordinate his army with the French Navy, the war might finally reach its decisive moment. The plan was bold, and secrecy was vital. Washington marched his army south, leaving New York under British eyes, while French forces under the Comte de Rochambeau joined him. The two armies moved swiftly, covering hundreds of miles in weeks. By autumn, they converged on Virginia with one purpose: to trap Cornwallis. At sea, the French struck the crucial blow. In September 1781, off the Chesapeake, de Grasse's fleet clashed with the Royal Navy in the Battle of the Capes. The British, long masters of the ocean, were repelled. With the Chesapeake sealed, Cornwallis's lifeline was cut. No reinforcements, no evacuation. His army was alone. On land, the noose tightened. Washington, Rochambeau, Lafayette, and their combined American-French forces surrounded Yorktown. Siege lines crept forward day by day, cannons roaring, trenches inching closer. Cornwallis's men, once confident, now found themselves battered by relentless bombardment. Entire redoubts were shattered, their defenses collapsing under storm after storm of artillery fire. Then came the assaults. American and French troops stormed British positions in coordinated night attacks, seizing key fortifications with bayonets and sheer determination. Among the Americans was Alexander Hamilton, who led his men in a furious charge to capture Redoubt 10, cementing his name in the Revolution's lore. With each position lost, Cornwallis's defenses crumbled. Inside Yorktown, the situation became desperate. Ammunition dwindled, food ran short, and disease spread among the trapped soldiers. Cornwallis attempted a breakout across the York River, but storms scattered his boats, dashing his last hope of escape. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis accepted the inevitable. He surrendered more than 7,000 men, his once proud army marching out with drums muffled, muskets stacked, and flags furled. The surrender at Yorktown was not the final battle of the Revolution, but it was its breaking point. In London, news of the defeat struck like a thunderbolt. Parliament, weary of the cost, divided in will, and burdened by global war, began to lose its appetite for continuing. For America, Yorktown was not just a victory, it was vindication. After years of retreat, hunger, and despair, the cause of independence had triumphed in the most dramatic fashion possible. The trap had sprung, an empire had been humbled, a new nation had been born. It is tempting to believe the revolution was decided at Yorktown, that Cornwallis's surrender ended the war in a single stroke. But history rarely fits so neatly into dramatic moments. Britain still had soldiers, ships, and resources. In theory, another army could have been sent, another campaign launched. The true question was not whether Britain could fight on, but whether it had the will. By 1781, the empire was stretched to its limits. Britain was no longer merely suppressing a colonial rebellion, it was fighting a world war. French fleets threatened the Atlantic. Spain pressed along the Gulf Coast and besieged Gibraltar with tens of thousands of troops. Dutch financiers backed America's cause. British merchants watched nervously as their trade routes strained under blockade and privateers. What began as a punitive expedition in the colonies had become a struggle for imperial survival. At home, Parliament fractured. Voices in London argued bitterly over strategy. Some urged continued war, insisting America must not be abandoned. Others, weary of the mounting debt and rising taxes, pressed for peace. Every month the war dragged on, its costs multiplied. British taxpayers shouldered the burden of supplying troops across an ocean, while their own livelihoods withered under the strain. Public opinion, once fiery with patriotic resolve, turned sour. Meanwhile, the Americans held the one advantage Britain could not match: endurance. Washington's army, though often defeated, had never been destroyed. The Revolution survived setbacks because its very nature demanded only survival, not conquest. For Britain, holding the colonies meant endless occupation, endless expense, and endless resistance. For the Americans, simply refusing to break was enough. The vastness of the land also played its part. No matter how many cities Britain captured, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, the countryside slipped from its grasp as soon as the troops marched away. Victory on the battlefield rarely translated into control of the population. The Patriots, though divided and often disorganized, sustained a cause that seemed to grow stronger the longer it endured. International support sealed Britain's fate. French muskets, French silver, French fleets. These gave the Americans the ability not only to fight, but to win. Without the French at Yorktown, Cornwallis would not have been trapped. Without Dutch loans, Congress could not have paid its soldiers. Without Spain, Britain would not have been forced to defend itself on so many fronts. The Revolution was never truly America alone against Britain. It was Britain against a coalition of rivals eager to see its power diminished. In the end, Britain did not lose because it lacked soldiers or commanders, nor because its army was inferior. It lost because the war demanded more than it could give. Distance, politics, money, and the sheer stubbornness of its enemies combined to sap its will. By 1782, when negotiations began in Paris, the truth was undeniable. The empire could not sustain the fight. Thus, the revolution was not won by a single battle, but by a slow accumulation of pressures. The Americans endured. The French, Spanish, and Dutch intervened. The British exhausted themselves. And together, these forces conspired to make independence inevitable. When the guns finally fell silent and the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, the world had changed forever. A collection of colonies, once dismissed as unruly dependents of the crown, had forced the most powerful empire on earth to yield. The American Revolution had begun as a protest over taxes and representation. It ended as the birth of a new nation. But its legacy was more complicated than the triumphant myths that would later take root. For patriots, the revolution was proof that endurance, sacrifice, and determination could overcome impossible odds. For loyalists, it was a bitter exile, their homes burned, their lands confiscated, their loyalty branded as betrayal. Tens of thousands fled north to Canada or across the sea, their lives upended by a war they had never chosen. For enslaved Africans and Native Americans, the revolution's promise of liberty was often hollow. Many fought, on both sides, in the hope of freedom or survival, only to find their futures unchanged or even worsened by independence. The revolution also revealed the paradox of American identity. It was a war of liberation, but also a civil war. It drew strength from ideals of liberty and self-rule, yet depended heavily on foreign monarchies to succeed. Its leaders were flawed men, sometimes brilliant, sometimes selfish, sometimes treacherous. Yet out of their contradictions, a republic was born. Internationally, the revolution shook the foundations of empire. Monarchs across Europe watched nervously, aware that if a colonial rebellion could succeed in America, the spark might spread. Indeed, within a decade, revolution would erupt in France, toppling a king and rewriting the political order of Europe. Across Latin America, independence movements drew inspiration from the American struggle. The revolution did not end with America. It ignited a century of upheaval across the world. And yet, memory has often softened its edges. We imagine heroic minutemen and steadfast leaders, but forget the hunger at Valley Forge, the divisions in the countryside, the uncertainty that plagued every step. We tell of triumph at Yorktown, but less often of the weary years of retreat and defeat that preceded it. The revolution was not inevitable, nor was it clean. It was messy, brutal, and deeply human. Still, from those hardships came something enduring. the conviction that a people could shape their own destiny. The United States would wrestle for generations with the meaning of its revolution, striving, and often failing, to live up to the ideals it proclaimed. But in the autumn of 1781, when Cornwallis's men stacked their muskets at Yorktown, and in 1783, when Britain finally recognized independence, a door opened that could not be closed again. The legacy of the Revolution is not just in battles won or treaties signed. It is in the questions it left behind, the questions of liberty, identity, and endurance that still echo across history. The Revolution was, at once, a war of muskets and bayonets, of hunger and frost, of diplomacy and endurance. It was America's first great test, and it was survived. Out of that survival, a nation was born.